were preparing for this panel, we got into a really interesting discussion about the journey that we've been on with inclusion and how there have been some moments of the word I think we used was backlash, right? Mm-hmm. And how we can manage through that. And Janet, I believe you were the one that brought up. I'd love if you could comment a little bit more on what you meant, because I feel like it is a little bit linked when you talk about the time and the intentionality and how it can be hard depending on how it is perceived by others.
Right. Well, I think in this time, right now, in this era in the United States, we are seeing some sentiments among some parts of the population that these types of efforts are going too far, okay? Yeah. And that they're unfair to others, right? And that's what I mean by humility and openness. I think we have to include and listen to those folks as well and understand what their issues might be. Because what we're talking about here is not that. It's not what they're objecting to, okay? But somehow something's been lost in translation. And, I think, Janice, I agree with you. My experience, of course, I've always been out there my whole career. And so change management is really hard. And there's always a giant number of people who don't want to, I've been saying to people, I can't understand why people give me awards and everything, because every single person has opposed every single thing I've tried to do. Right? So how come now it's okay, right? Or at least that's how it feels, right? Every change I've tried to bring about for 30 years, right? Just, no. And so we shouldn't be surprised at this, okay? Mm-hmm. Because it really is a regular human. But I feel like, frankly, some of the rhetoric on either side actually isn't inclusive, okay? Mm-hmm. Including those who are on the side of inclusion. And that isn't going to be successful. That's kind of my take on this, if you're interested. I mean, is that we have to include and listen to those who are experiencing these negative feelings and try to figure out what are they, where are they coming from, why are they experiencing, engage with them as well as with sort of the people who are trying to push forward on this. Mm-hmm. And that's usual in change management.
Yeah. Can I just jump in on that?
Please.
I mean, I think language matters. I think that's what you were trying to get to. The language matters significantly because it could feel exclusive to those who may understand the underlying goal, but the way you used your language and the tone that's being communicated almost feels as though you are trying to favor one community to the detriment of another community. Yeah. And that's actually not what we mean at all. No. What we're trying to say is let's include everyone. Mm-hmm. And what I love about some illustrations around equality and equity is that everyone needs maybe a slightly different level in order to be able to look over the fence. If you remember that picture that people have used in the past.
Yeah, and as a member of the short group of people, I totally agree with I need a stool or a
little towel.
I am the shortest in my family. I need a little bit of that extra bump up. But what we're talking about is every community, whether you're in the rural community, whether you're in an urban setting, whether you're in poor, whether you're in wealthy, how do we just ensure that we have fit for purpose policies that are relevant to each of those communities? Yeah. The second thing that I would say is that we need to move from the moral obligation to the business imperative, right? Mm-hmm. The way we talk about inclusion and diversity is really sometimes driven by almost an apology, right? Mm-hmm. We did wrong, and so we need to correct that from a moral perspective. And of course, there is a moral perspective and social justice perspective that's really about a business imperative. We're thinking about the sustainability and not the short-term play here, because the long-term sustainability, you can certainly relate and talk about this, is that we have whole communities that can benefit from medicines, right? We're talking about clinical trials from medicines, and they want to know, is that medicine going to work on me, for me? Was I included in that research? Am I in an average, right? And the average was a bit, constructed by other communities. And so there's a business imperative to say, you were included in this research. This medicine may benefit you depending on whatever the outcome is,
Right.
and therefore you can get access to this medicine for the condition in which you're struggling with. I mean, we talk about this from a whole variety of different perspectives, whether it's chronic disease or rare diseases, Jody, with all of your work, that all these communities just want to know a simple answer. I'm sick. Can I get access to an intervention, a product, a therapy, a vaccine that's helpful for me? And was I included in that clinical research? And the business part of it also then goes to say, as you're making decisions about sites, do those providers have experience with these medicines? And they can then talk to their communities effectively about these medicines. And if they're never included in the research, right, we know the timeline from research and studies to intervention could be upwards of 10 years. The communities might never have access to the latest therapeutic or benefit from it. So it's really, for me, about changing it from a moral conversation to a business conversation.
Also, there's a scientific imperative here, particularly like for genetics. I mean, if you just study a certain somewhat homogeneous population, you're not going to understand actually basic variability and what drives it and so forth. So, and that's, I think, true in drug development as well.
Absolutely. And, when you think about those that we work with in the communities, the first thing you have to think about is, so goal setting, because to make it intentional, right, it's not just about, what does census look like and what does the epidemiology look like, but then you got to think about, okay, am I selecting the right demographic of the sites to be able to get in those communities? And if not, then what do we need to do then to be able to help in those communities to really, bring about the right individuals that can have the conversation, because it's somebody like them that they're going to listen to, that they're going to understand. That's a big part of what we need to do, and you got to make that piece intentional.
Well, but I'll give you a hard time about
Of
this.
course you will.
You need not only a relationship with those folks, but they need to have the infrastructure resources to be able to perform. Like during the pandemic, it was very clear that the preferred sites of the pharmaceutical industry could perform very rapidly. They'd been trained, they had the infrastructure, they had the resources. We had people, dying in satellite hospitals in the ICU. They couldn't be enrolled in the trials, right? Because they'd never done any research and they'd never been invited and supported. So I think the current efforts that are going on are really, really important in this regard, because it isn't, like you said, it's not just a moment. It's going to be a commitment over time and take money.
It takes money and time, and you're right, because in most cases, right, we do a lot of work at a lot of the academic research.
Yeah.
And who can afford to go to those, right? And so it's absolutely clear that we have to get closer into the communities and we have to develop the infrastructure.
Right.
And it's not just one company, it's actually a society that we have to take on that responsibility and do it.
Yeah.
There's a life cycle to it, right? It's the research life cycle. If we want to continue to do research, we need to be continuing to engage with the communities who need them.
And that's where I give NIH some grief, okay?
Yeah,
Because
I know you do.
can't
I'm glad to
just
give somebody else some grief.
Of course. I mean, all equal opportunity grants.
We'll get the time. Yeah.
Grants, the structure of grants. So
Yes.
you go in there, you give them money, and then you go away.
Yes.
Or you have to make some giant application again. And it is, in PCORI, I'm on the PCORI board, and, I'm constantly saying infrastructure. We've, sure, it's wonderful to give out these grants and blah, 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 and everything, and the great basic science, but it's not really going to advance the clinical research infrastructure to do things that way.
Yeah, and to that point too, I think one of the things that I'd like to see us do even more in grants is talk about not just then the research that's needed, but also how do we ensure that we're building in access to care?
Yeah.
How do we think about what are the questions that this research will need to ask the FDA? What are the questions that this research will need to ask CMS? And start to build those in early on in that life cycle, and talking about the communities, but also talking about how that will come back to the communities. And then one other thing I think that we're trying to really build upon is we've been talking about this on the clinical side, but we're also thinking that this is very important on the preclinical side. We would love to see building in more of a sort of an equity lens on the models that we're building. We typically use rodent models and 2D cell culture models, But now we're working on 3D bioprinted models and tissue chips and multiple organs on a chip, et cetera. These are new types of models that need new approaches. And we have the ability to bring in that equity lens now that we've never had before. And I think that is going to be imperative as we move forward in that space, especially with the Modernization Act.
Can I just push back on the grant piece for just a moment? Because
please.
I had an aha moment just last week. I was speaking with a pastor of a large church who was involved in the COVID trials, the Novavax trials in particular. And just exactly what you said, there was a helicopter science to some degree where they came in, built capacity for engaging in trials, and then went away. And I said, okay, well, what you need are grants to establish your infrastructure. He says, Esther, I don't want to talk about grants anymore. It feels like a charity. I want to be part of the business of being a site operator where I have ongoing transactions. And by the way, we do a whole variety of other things. We do screening, we provide food, we provide access to different services, education, awareness. We are a one-stop shop in our community, and I don't want hand-me-down grants anymore. Can I be considered and qualified as a site provider of and work with a whole variety of different partners as a partner of choice? And that moves us a bit away from this sometimes paternalistic top-down perspective. Apply for this grant, we'll give it to you for a certain number of years. By the way, it's sort of like trickle-down economics. We'll give it to the academic institutions, and hopefully at some point it'll come down to you, which in some ways ends up not really coming down to them. And when it does, it's in really incremental small dollars that it cannot do big transformational things. So I think we just need to think about it from a nuanced perspective. And I could only get that insight. Why? Because I talked to somebody who was outside of our typical community, and I said, grants. He said, Esther, I don't want to talk about grants anymore. Or is there a different model?
And that's interesting too, because in order for it to be sustainable, it has to be a business. Many clinical trialists, regardless of where they are in the United States, often only do one trial because they lose money.
It's such a pain in the behind.
That's right. There's all these things associated with it, right? So imagine an organization that has never done it before and comes in the first time, and they get all this handhold, and then they're left to go off and do. Like, it is training in the business aspect of it. How do you sort of create a business out of this? And that's where probably most of the efforts needs to be, to create a sustainable business that cares for people, but also then can engage in clinical research because they're not losing, funds to do such.
And clinical trials are changing. We're seeing more, drug modalities that are in the, very specific precision medicine kinds of space that are starting to come along. We're going to need innovative ways that's going to require these also innovative ways of engaging in this way. So,
well, there's almost like competing, because the more the precision medicines come through, the infrastructure required to run them is different.
Yes,
and
exactly.
that can be in direct tension to
Yes.
what we're trying to do with more inclusivity.